Well, we've really got the soil in great shape for our annual flower bed here, but of course it's still a little bit too early for us to be planting those transplants, but we do have them started in the greenhouse, and we'll probably plant those around the middle of April. But of course we've got a few of our perennial type plants over here, such as our juniper and our saucer magnolia. And March is really the month that we need to start fertilizing a lot of our trees and shrubs. However, I want to point out to you that you really need to look at your whole landscape and decide what practices you've been using as far as fertility. As an example, these plants are in this annual planting bed, and we fertilize those several times during the growing season. And because of that, there's really no need for us to put additional fertilizer on for these shrubs and trees because they're taking those nutrients up during the growing season. And the worst thing that we want to do is put on too much fertilizer where they might be more susceptible to insects and even cause some splitting just in the rapid growth rate. So those we'll just leave alone until we plant our annuals behind me. Now up here is another case where we've got the saucer magnolia as well. And you can tell these warm days are really getting things interested in growing. The buds are starting to swell on the saucer magnolia. And we've got some crocus down here that we planted back last fall, and these were some of our antique flower bulbs. This particular one is the Crocus Advance, and as you can see, we've got some nice little yellow flowers that are already blooming. And it's still not too early for us to really be getting some cold snaps and some temperatures that might drop down into the 20s again. If your flower bulbs are starting to come up already, you may want to watch those, and if we're going to get a cold spell, you may want to try to cover those with some mulch to maybe prolong them a little bit more. But again, this is an area where we've had some lantana, we put a lot of annuals, so there's really no need for us to fertilize these trees separately, so we'll wait on those a little bit longer. But let me remind you, when purchasing your fertilizer for this time of year, you really need to look at that label and read the label and determine what you're purchasing. We took a soil test, so we need mostly nitrogen. We don't really need a lot of phosphorus and potassium in certain parts of our gardens. But on the label, this particular one is a 31-3-10. But what's so important is that you find on the label where it talks about the nitrogen. And if you see words such as water insoluble, water soluble, control released, those are key words that you need to look for. This one is 6.7% water insoluble nitrogen. That means that that percentage is going to dissolve very rapidly. Now, the key to it is trying to get a control release or a slow release nitrogen because it will last longer. You have less chances of getting contamination in groundwater. You'll divide it up a little bit more. It will benefit the plants more. However, usually a slow release fertilizer is going to cost a lot more too, but that's still a benefit in the long run. Now, if you get a fertilizer such as nitrogen, this one is urea, it's going to be pretty much 100% water soluble. And that means that the first rain or irrigation that you put on it, it's going to dissolve down and pretty much be inactive for you. So it's going to be cheaper, but you can apply it just as safe if you'll cut down the amount that you're putting on and maybe put on gradual amounts of fertilizer. So it's real important that you read the label, do some price comparisons, but try to figure out again just what you're trying to do. Are you in an area where you're going to get runoff into a creek or into a pond, or just runoff into the sewer system? So if you use a slow release, you're going to cut down on those chances, or use your water soluble that's going to dissolve quicker. Try to use it a little bit more sparingly and just use common sense again. Now, a lot of us will have trees and shrubs in our landscape that are growing right in our lawns, and we fertilize our lawns on a routine basis. Those roots from those trees and shrubs are going to be growing out into the lawn and take up some of the nutrients. So really, if you're maintaining your lawn or landscape and you're fertilizing it on a routine basis, you may not need to fertilize those trees and shrubs. Try to think what practices you're using. But if you've got a tree or shrub that's out by itself and it's maybe had some problems with insects or disease, now again would be a good time to fertilize it by itself. And you can use rates based on the diameter of that tree, and usually it's about 3 pounds per inch diameter, and that's measured about 4 feet high. If you've got a smaller tree, about 1 to 2.5 pounds will be plenty. Just broadcast around it. There's no need to dig holes and put the fertilizer in it, just right on top of the ground and water it in. But try to split those applications. If you've got a large tree, you may end up putting 50 or 75 pounds of fertilizer on it. Split those up. Put half of it on now and maybe half again in April or again in the fall. But try to split them up so you don't get too much growth at one time. And then for the shrub beds that you haven't fertilized and you need to follow through on, usually the rate is about 1 to 2 pounds per 100 square feet. So keep those amounts in mind. And it's also a good time for us to go over and fertilize our fruit trees too. So we'll go over in the orchard and do a little bit of work on those as well. Well, the same principles for fertilizing the landscape really are the same for our fruit orchard as well. We've got several of our trees that are planted right in our fescue lawn, and we fertilize the fescue probably anywhere from 2 to 3 times a year. And those tree roots really have grown out into the fescue, so they're getting a lot of the nutrient supplement as we fertilize our lawn. So we're really not going to fertilize all of our fruit trees, especially the peaches and apples and cherries are doing really good. But we do have a few trees here in the orchard, such as this Asian pear that is stunted. It really hasn't taken off like it should. Plus the deer have started to feed on the bark and have caused a lot of damage there as well. So some of these trees that are a little bit more stressed, we will go ahead and put an application of fertilizer on just for those trees. Now, we've got the mulch on, and the grass, even though it's cool season, it's somewhat dormant. So now when we put this application on in March, late February, it's gonna really benefit the tree. But remember again that a soil test is real important. You need to know what it's deficient in. You shouldn't just be putting out fertilizer for the heck of it. You really need to know what to spend your money on. Our soil test here came back really pretty good for phosphorus and potassium again, although both of those were right on the border. So the ratio that we have chosen is a 16:4:8, which is a pretty good ratio. We've not got a lot of nitrogen, so we don't stimulate too much growth. And what we're going to do is just broadcast this fertilizer by hand, and we want to go a ways out. A lot of times you hear people talk about the drip line, and those roots are growing out into the grass here. So just broadcast that fertilizer around, and again, the water will wash it in right, pretty quickly. You don't really need to deep root feed them or anything like that. Just try to keep from getting fertilizer up against the trunk. And we've measured out about 2 pounds on this tree because this particular tree is right around 2 years old, and the best way to figure up the rates for your fruit trees is 1 pound per year of age of tree. So if you've got a 10-year-old tree, you'd put on 10 pounds. However, monitor those trees. If they're really growing healthy, we usually say 6 to 8 to 10 pounds is the max. So the older trees just put on around 6 to 8 to 10 pounds. And again, that's broadcast, but that's an awful lot of fertilizer to be putting on at one time. So split it up, put on part of it now, and then after you've harvested the fruit, you might put some more on. But again, I'm going to emphasize it one more time. It really depends on your maintenance program and how well you're taking care of the lawn and all of the things together. You see, they really do fit together as a system, and that's how we should really try to come up with a fertilizer program. Now our small fruits that we've got right here on the other side, just on the south side of the orchard, we've got some of our raspberries, and we've also got some of our blackberries. The blackberries are doing really good. We don't really need to put any more supplemental fertilizer on them. Again, we think they'll get plenty from the fertilizer applications with the lawn. However, the raspberries are starting to decline a little bit. The branches are diseased. And so we'll put on the same amount of fertilizer or the same type as 16-4-8, but the recommendations for your small fruits are about 1 to 2 pounds per 100 square feet. So we'll measure up our bed and weigh out the amount of fertilizer and just broadcast it down beside the beds. Now blueberries, let me remind you, are a totally different story. Those fertilizers need to contain a little bit of sulfur and iron to help keep that pH low. So when you're selecting your fertilizer for your blueberries, make sure that it has those two nutrients in it, because they have a little bit different requirements as well.
We hope you've enjoyed this classic from the Oklahoma Gardening Vault. Remember, even though these tips and techniques are timeless, there's always something new to learn in the world of gardening. By subscribing to both Oklahoma Gardening and OK Gardening Classics, you'll have access to a wealth of gardening knowledge, both classic and contemporary.